Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes and a very special guest indeed, Professor Brendan Sweetman of Rockhurst University. We'll begin always in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, gentle listeners, as it happens, both co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes and Professor Brendan Sweetman are in the greater Kansas area. And probably since there's nothing greater than Kansas itself, they'll both be leading the way for us today. So I wonder, Professor Sweetman has written and spoken widely on what some say we shouldn't discuss at the dinner table, religion and politics. That'll leave us plenty of time to discuss table manners. But at any rate, I think that Mario should get us launched this morning. What do you say, Mario?
Good morning, Brendan, and good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Mario.
The topic, I think, is very interesting for our audience, and we have been touching a little bit about those topics, the relationship between religion and politics. So I would start with that question, which I think is the core of Brendan's thinking, which is the issue of pluralism. And asking the question, what problems do you think does pluralism pose?
Yeah, that's a good question, Mario and Jim, I think, to start with. I've been working on religion and politics for a number of years, and I think that the first thing we have to begin with is pluralism itself, and it's the idea that, you know, we're in what we might call a pluralist democracy. And that means a democracy where we have a lot of different, I like the term worldviews particularly, because the reason I like that term is it's a term that's more neutral than saying we have a lot of different religions, and then trying to, you know, fit in secularism or secularist views as well into the mix of views. And, you know, worldview is neutral because it captures whatever your position is on the big questions of life and culture and morality and politics, whether it be religious or secularist or whatever. You can put them all under the umbrella of worldview. So instead of just asking, like, for example, what role should religion have in politics, I think it's much more instructive nowadays to ask, what role should your worldview have in politics? That way the question includes everybody who has a worldview. It's not just a question you're asking of religious believers. So that's why I like that term, worldview. Now, coming back to the pluralism point, I think that what we have today is, in our democracy, we have a pluralism of worldviews. And that creates a difficulty because the worldviews disagree with each other strongly on some topics. Not on everything, but on some topics. And they disagree with each other nowadays so strongly that I think we could say they are irreconcilable on some topics. And so the task of trying to find like a middle ground or a consensus or some sort of a compromise, that's becoming more difficult because of the fact that we have splintered, if you like, into different worldviews. And so the problem, Mario, you asked a question there about what problems does it bring up. I think the problem is, you know, when everybody has a different worldview and the worldviews differ significantly on the big questions of life and culture, how do you proceed then as a democratic society? How do you make law? How do you rule in such a way that everybody at least feels like they have an equal say in the political process. It seems to me that's the difficulty that we're facing today, and it is a considerable difficulty.
Okay, you said something. I'm going to follow up on your your answer. You said something which I think many people ask themselves. You said, well, while worldviews are neutral in themselves, there are, in general, I can summarize these in two very broad worldview. One is a naturalist worldview, or more a neutral worldview, and the other may be a Christian worldview. Is that definition or that description accurate, do you think?
Well, it's accurate in a philosophical sense, but in a political sense we have to be careful with it. I think philosophically you could put, you might perhaps have two categories of worldviews, at least to begin with. One would be a religious category, and the other might be a secularist category. And, one of the things, just as a side note, which we can discuss later, that I want to stress is I do think secularism is becoming a very significant worldview today. So we have to take that into account in a serious way when we discuss these questions in a way we didn't in the past. But if we just go back for a moment to the religious category, they would be worldviews which, believe that there is a supernatural order. And, they might believe that there is a supreme being. And we can define it very generally so that every religion would more or less fit into it. And then they might also hold, general foundational beliefs, or what sometimes we might call metaphysical beliefs, of the sort that, human beings have a body and soul, there's an afterlife, there's a moral order which God has put in place, things like that. They would all be religious beliefs. And so any worldview that has some subset of those beliefs, we could put into the category of the religious worldview generally described. And then on the other side, you could have secularist worldviews. These would be worldviews, you used the word there, Mario, the naturalist worldview. Naturalism is becoming a common term now to describe secularism. Sometimes it's called philosophical atheism. In the past, it used to be called materialism or scientism, but they're all the same view. And they hold some version of the view that, everything that exists is physical in nature and has some kind of scientific explanation in terms of matter and energy, including the human person. And then they would eventually have to develop, and they're in the middle of this, I think, now, moral and political beliefs. They'd have to have a full theory, in other words, of all the issues that a worldview needs to describe. Now, the reason I say philosophically you can put, I think, worldviews broadly into those categories, but at the political level, sometimes it's the case that some religious believers, let's think about this. We can't really talk nowadays. One of the problems of pluralism is you can't just talk about the religious worldview. The reason for that is because many people who would fit into the category of religious worldview that we just described, they don't agree on moral, political, social, and cultural questions, or even economic questions. And so what I mean there is, at the political level, it could be that quite a number of religious believers agree with secularist views on some of these questions, and not with traditional religious views. So there could be some overlap between the political interests, say, of some secularists and some religious believers. And that's why, even though we can say, yes, there's two broad categories, it wouldn't follow from that politically or morally everybody in each category would agree on every issue.
That seems right to me, and let me stir the pot here a little bit. We've come to be familiar with this term nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, nuns.
Yes.
Now, I want to expand on the nuns category, and I want to do so in a way that connects with worldviews. We just got notice last week that in October, Cardinal Newman is going to be canonized. And one of his early books, not much read, a novel, actually, is called Loss and Gain. And its setting is undergraduates and graduate students, oftentimes engaged in the study of divinity at Oxford. And lo and behold, at that time, some people were described as viewish, and many people who were encouraged not to become viewish. And if you were viewish, that means you had an agenda and things you were plumping for. And if you had avoided becoming viewish, then you were just a hail fellow, well met, and somebody everybody could work with. Now, what I'm thinking is that a lot of people today would need the term worldview to be explained, as you have, and very well. And maybe the reason why they need it explained is because they don't think of themselves as having a worldview. And it might well be that they don't have a worldview. So what are your thoughts about the very possibility of not having a worldview? And I mentioned Newman and the British, just muddling through. And a whole lot of politicians tell us they're pragmatic, which I suppose is one way of saying I'm just muddling through.
Yeah, now, Jim, there's a lot of issues there. Let me comment on a few of them. That Newman quote there is very interesting. We'll come back to it now just in a second. But on worldviews generally, let me just say a couple of things about those. A worldview I like to define this way, if you want to try to think of it formally, and we don't have to, get bogged down on this, but it's something to keep in mind when we're talking about the concept. It covers, I like to say, three areas of beliefs. And they are beliefs about the nature of reality, what we sometimes call metaphysical beliefs, beliefs about the nature of the human person, and beliefs about moral and political values, including your political theory. And what I'm saying is people can organize their beliefs about the key questions of life and culture under those headings to try to figure out their worldview if they have some doubt about whether they have a worldview or not. Now, what I'm trying to say about that is that in our pluralist society, everybody does have a worldview in that sense, positions on those topics. And some people might be more activist about it, more aware of it, more conscious of it, etc., see their worldview, see their actions and their task in life and things like that in terms of their worldview and beliefs, and some might not. That's fine. But what I'm trying to say is in our pluralist society, we are getting more conscious of our worldviews. And that brings me now, secondly, to Newman's notion there of the viewish. It's a great term because I think today more and more people are becoming viewish, to use his term. In other words, they're becoming more aware of what they believe and what these beliefs imply about society and politics, and therefore more likely to act on them. And pluralism adds into the mix, I think, that they are becoming more aware of the fact that other people in our society don't agree with them, and that it's a difficult question on some of these issues, so that there isn't unanimity or consensus. So, they realize that there's a kind of a struggle involved politically if they want to assert some of their worldviews, some of their beliefs, to influence culture. And then just moving on to the nones question there, that's a very interesting concept, and there's some debate about how to define a none, N-O-N-E, but my view is it's better to define it today at the moment negatively. And what I mean by that is I think the nones are define themselves or understand themselves more generally in terms of what they do not believe rather than in terms of what they do believe. And what they don't believe is they are rejecting traditional religion and particularly maybe in some cases at least the organized or the institutional churches. But they're not necessarily rejecting the religious attitude to reality, at least not completely. And that's why they sometimes describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And what they mean by that, again, negatively, I think, is they're affirming some kind of spiritual dimension or spiritual aspect maybe to their own lives, but they're rejecting the formal discussion of it or practice of it in religions. Now, the reason they're doing that, I think, why would you adopt a negative attitude like that? It's because they disagree with the churches on any number of things, but sometimes on moral questions. It's not just because they disagree with the institution or they think the institution is corrupt or they think that they don't really live out their religion, they just talk. All these are familiar criticisms of the churches. But I think they reject some of the moral positions of the church. And so what that means is if you think about yourself as spiritual but not religious, I think you have to reach a stage where you start thinking about what you do believe, not just what you reject. So people in that position will eventually have to work out, what it is they believe about spirituality. Do they believe there is a spiritual dimension to existence? Do they believe there is a transcendent dimension? What does the spiritual dimension imply about their moral beliefs? They have to get to all those questions in the end, or to put it in our earlier language, they have to become a bit more viewish about their position, or in my language, they have to get a little bit more concerned with articulating their worldview positively, in positive terms, to say what they actually believe. And I think many people are going through that process today, especially young people. So therefore, what I'm saying is, gentlemen, the concept of a worldview is becoming very common, allied to the notion of pluralism.
That's very helpful. I think you've sorted out things in a very constructive way. But let me ask one more question, and it's a question that we've often considered on the open door. In this coming to work out one's positive views, and doing so in contemporary American life, do you see argument, as in rational argument, do you see that as playing a central role, a peripheral role? What's the place for logical, reasonable analysis?
Yes. Now, I do, in my own position, I do place a lot of emphasis on rational argument. The way to think about it is, if you, say you want to influence culture by means of your beliefs, I think in a pluralist society where people disagree about a lot of issues, you need to present a rational case for your position. And now that doesn't mean that when you present the rational case that it necessarily has to persuade everybody. That's a different question. But nevertheless, you have to make an effort, I would say, to be reasonable. And that means now that you would give a kind of a rational argument and you would be logical, you would look at objections. We're not talking about any fancy notion of reason. We're talking about ordinary common sense arguments. You'd look at the evidence if it was relevant. You'd consider what other people have to say. There's certain virtues of reasoning as well, where you listen to the other side and you make sure you're informed and all those good things. And so, we're saying philosophically, yes, you should try to present a rational argument. Now, thinking about it just a little bit more deeper than that, sometimes, Jim, in response to this, people will often say that if you have that criterion, that religious beliefs can't satisfy it, that they are not reasonable beliefs. Now, a big part of my argument in my book on this subject is that religious beliefs are reasonable. There's a whole tradition of, outstanding thinkers in the history of ideas presenting the rational case for theistic beliefs. Now, the thing is, this is a very subtle but I think key point in the debate. they're arguing for what I would call a reasonable faith. And by that I mean that they're not denying that there is a faith aspect to your beliefs. And let's be careful about what we mean by that. We mean that there does come a stage when you're dealing with worldview topics, just because of the nature of the subject matter. And remember, it refers to beliefs about reality, the human person, and morality and politics, all difficult topics and not really topics that are scientifically accessible in the way like physics and chemistry might be accessible. So there's a certain amount of faith involved when you commit to positions on those questions. And by faith there we mean that you make a commitment to believe something that involves a movement of the will as well as of the intellect. But the key point about that is that the commitment you make has to be a reasonable commitment. So, you use reason as much as you can to develop a rational case for your view, and then you commit to it. And by the way, the same is true in any worldview, in my way of thinking, including the secularist worldview. Any worldview that has beliefs about those topics we mentioned earlier, at some stage involves a certain element of faith, in the sense that you have to commit to believe something and to act on it. You won't be able to give a scientific proof because it simply isn't that sort of subject. But that doesn't mean you just believe anything. It means that you try to develop a rational case. Now, given that, what I'm arguing is you can develop a rational case for your religious worldview, many of your religious beliefs, in a good way, and then you can present them publicly. Now, sometimes people will say back to that, gentlemen, they'll say, well, what about if you present what you think is a rational or reasonable argument publicly, but then we listen to it and we think it isn't. We don't think it's a reasonable argument. Now, the problem with that is it doesn't matter what other people think, because we're not, in a democratic context, assuming democratic values, it's not necessary for somebody to think your view is rational or reasonable before you can bring it up. It's only necessary for you to think it's reasonable. That's the requirement, at least I'm putting on it, that you yourself should hold that it is a reasonable belief and be able to try to show it. If other people listen to it and they're not really convinced, that's fine. You might have the same position about their beliefs. But we don't use somebody else's agreement as a kind of, gatekeeper for what beliefs you can actually present in the public square. Now, let me just give you an example of the sort of belief I'm talking about. And I like to use Martin Luther King as an example because I've analyzed his work very carefully, and it's fascinating to see throughout all his essays the way he tries to develop a rational case for his position, but his position is clearly religious. But just to summarize his case very roughly, what he's saying is he thinks that God exists, he believes in natural law, and he thinks that all human beings were created equally by God, and he also believes that that belief has political implications. And then a lot of his writings are developing those ideas. And then his political work, of course, was trying to put those ideas into practice. Now, that's an example of a reasonable religious argument presented in the political arena. Now, somebody might listen to that and say, well, we don't think it's reasonable. And, when he did present it, as we know, many people did reject it in one way or another. Even people of goodwill who were kind of on board with him on the moral question thought that he should just stay quiet for the moment. But the thing is, it doesn't matter whether other people think it's reasonable or not. That's what the whole debate is about. In a way, I think the public square debate in a democracy is a kind of a test of the rationality of certain beliefs. And that's fine. Maybe it should work that way. But you don't have to, you can't allow somebody else to decide in advance whether you can introduce your belief into politics or not. If you take that stance, it doesn't satisfy democratic values of freedom of expression and, the freedom to arrive at your own worldview beliefs and to try to develop them in a rational way.
Gee, there's a lot of good thinking going on there, a lot, and doubtless we're going to come back to that, but I think Mario is set to raise the next question.
Yes, I have a follow-up question to your description of rationality in the public square. Is there any way that we can distinguish between worldviews according to their degree of rationality in the same way that we can distinguish scientific theories, or that is impossible?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mario. And the whole question about the truth of scientific theories is itself controversial. But what I would like to say about that is, it brings us back again to the problem of pluralism. Because what you have is, you might have a group of people who think a certain position. Like, let's, for example, take a very important issue for this show, the topic of abortion. And we might have a group of people, one person or many people who think that the arguments against abortion are very reasonable. And then you might have a lot of people in society who look at those arguments and think they're not reasonable. Now, what you're saying is there any way to decide between the views? And the problem with that is, the way a democracy works is, I might look at a range of arguments on this topic and I might say, well, my view is the most reasonable view, and the other views are wrong in various ways, to varying degrees. I might judge them differently. I might think, well, some arguments are kind of interesting but wrong. They're sincere but misguided. They're kind of irrational. There might be a category where I think the argument is just ridiculous or something like that. And there's no way you can step outside that, outside the democratic process, to pronounce definitively which view is correct. Now, you can look at them and you say, well, now, I'm quite convinced rationally that my view is true. That's what most people do. They're very strongly convinced that their own view is correct. But the thing about a democratic context is, we can't speak for others on which view should dominate society, except just through voting on it. That's the way to settle it, in my view, is you settle it democratically. And the same thing, in a way, is true for scientific theories. How do you know that a scientific theory is true? And you can distinguish between the actual truth in reality and what scientists think is true. And what happens is, scientists come round to a consensus on what is true. That's how we decide that we have described objective reality correctly. And sometimes we know, the history of science is full of this, scientists make a judgment about something, consensus about something, but they later discover that they believed in that they were wrong on it, that they were misdescribing reality. But in the scientific domain, because it's a very easy domain to study, because of the subject matter, it's much more easy to get consensus. But the consensus could be wrong, and the same thing is true in politics. You could have a society where people had a consensus on some belief, but the consensus is wrong from the objective moral point of view. But the problem, Mario, is in our society, when you say, I think my view is objectively true, the correct position, and most people hold that view about most of their beliefs, what you mean by that is, although I think I'm correct and the other person is wrong, I know I can't speak for them on the question. Much as I would like to, we're very tempted to speak for the other person and to shut down their view, to censor them maybe, to intimidate them into silence. We're very tempted towards those things. They're all human failings. But we know that from a democratic point of view, they get to express their view, I get to express my view, and then the democratic process takes care of it. And sometimes the democratic process gets it wrong. And that's why, going back to Jim's earlier point, I think trying to frame your view rationally is very important because it's the minimal thing you can do. And it's not only that, to be a responsible thinker yourself, you should have a rational position, but you should be able to try to show other people that your position is rational too. They might not agree with it, but it's much more difficult, I think, to dismiss a view if you know that the person presenting it is presenting a pretty good argument for it. Because our society now has gotten so polarized, I think, especially in America, that our first reaction is to dismiss views we hear that we don't agree with, not to discuss them.
So,
go ahead, please.
Well, okay. So to what you attribute the fact that people cannot be persuaded by the argument of another, or we are not able to be persuaded by our neighbor's argument? Is there something in our human experience that prevent us from recognizing that someone's argument is more rational than ours?
Yeah, that's a hard one, Mario. There's a number of considerations, I think, relevant to the answer. I think that one general issue is freedom itself. The idea of freedom contains in it the fact that we should be able to, it's a moral point, a normative concept. We should be able to choose our own position on some of these big questions that affect us. That's kind of a radical notion, but that's what freedom means. And, one of I think it's Hamilton points out in the Federalist Papers, there's a very interesting quote about this. He says that when you give people freedom like that, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to come up with different views. It's inevitable, and it might take time, but it's absolutely inevitable that people won't sit down and reason out to the same conclusion. Eventually they'll come to pluralism. Now, why is that? Well, it's partly because you're giving them a choice, but it's also because the subject matter is very complicated. And on a lot of these questions, the answer is not as obvious. As we said earlier, like it might be in science. If you're studying the scientific data, that's much more clearly defined, even though sometimes there's even disputes about that. But, the subject matter of the human person and the nature of reality, they're very complicated subjects, morality, and people come to different views on them. That's a kind of a formal answer. Now, another perhaps formal position would be that I do think that today the whole notion of reason, just to go back to Jim's point, is kind of under assault in a number of disciplines. And by that I mean that some philosophers have the view, and it's beginning to catch on a little bit, that reason can't really give us solutions to these problems. Because they think that they might have what we call in philosophy an anti-realist view. It's the idea that you can never really step outside, your own subjectivity or your own biases, to put it in a modern way, to look at reality itself. And so if you go with a strong version of that view, you end up in a kind of relativistic position. And that would mean then that, you couldn't really get an objective way to look at reality because reason itself is kind of compromised. And if you took that position, you could understand why somebody might take the view that reason can't really help us. Now, the problem with the anti-realist, realist interpretation of reason is that it would open the door to irrationalism and indeed to any view. Somebody could put forward any view in the public square if the standard was that reason can't really back up any view and there's no point in trying to be rational about it because reason itself is compromised. That would open the door, it seems to me, to any position. So, including religious ones, or any view you wanted to put forward, because they would all, in a way, have a certain equal standing. But the price would be very high because it would be basically, a relativistic view. And then how would you govern in terms of law if you said this, if you didn't really use it? It's one thing if a guy believes his view is true and you get into a public debate and democratically he either wins or loses. At least he believes his view is correct. And the other people, if they win in the democratic debate, they think their view is true. But suppose we were all in the democratic debate and none of us really thought our view was true. We just thought one view was as good as another. And then whatever view wins then just wins because it has the power. That's a very pessimistic view of democracy. And then I would just add that other reasons why reason might not work publicly, there's a lot of human failing type of reasons where we might be influenced by selfishness or financial interests or, our own little private line of interests and things like that where it's in our interest, let's say, but not necessarily just moral interest. It could be in our political interest that where we get power or where financially it helps us or something for a certain view to prevail. There's all sorts of reasons why people don't reason in a good way publicly. Some might be philosophical, some could be because the subject matter is difficult, but other ones might be to do just with a failure of, our culture maybe in different the ways I've mentioned, but also maybe even in the educational system to teach, a rational approach to solving problems. Or another way to put that in a negative way, perhaps, gentlemen, is this. I do think today our culture and our society on these kind of issues is becoming more political. You even see it in academia now, where they don't discuss things so much. They're advocating a political position. And what does that mean? Well, it means that instead of reasoning things out first, they kind of move to the political spectrum or a political battle immediately. And that's a way of saying they don't really have any confidence in discussing things, because they don't think that's going to get them anywhere. They just go straight to the political machinations to try to establish their view. And I think you even see that now in academia.
Yes, you do.
You would agree with that, Jim. Professors, they see themselves in the classroom as being, they have a kind of political agenda they're trying to promote.
That's one of the reasons why I'm happy to call myself an independent scholar.
Yeah.
Couple things here. The first one is a fun thing. Mario and I have done a lot of shows, and none of our guests, have you noticed this, Mario? None of them has ever called us gentlemen.
Yes.
Yeah, well, maybe I made a mistake there, guys. We'll have to rethink that one.
At any rate, so let me push a little bit.
Yes, please.
With regard especially to democracy and the intersection, as some people say, between democracy, political notion, warranted assertion, philosophical notion, and sin, a personal experience for all of us. Churchill said, right, famously, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest.
Yes.
And there's something in his way of putting that. I did notice that at one point at least, it seemed to me that you were saying, and we need to do this because this is what democracy calls for. And as I think back over how I understood you, we need to be able to put forward our own position because that's what democracy calls for, and we don't have to say, well, somebody will disagree with me. Why, Uncle Fred disagrees with me, so I can't say what I think. We must say what we think because democracy calls for that. And democracy also calls for our letting the other person say what he thinks. And that seems to me to be a plausible way of speaking, but ultimately it makes democracy itself the source of fundamental values of what we might call, in a good sense, dialogue. It makes democracy itself the fundamental determiner of how we ought to interact with other people about things that we all have to deal with together, which is one of the ways I think about politics, things that we all have to work on together. I'm not even going to get into the freeway system in Los Angeles.
Yes.
But there is something deeper than that, and I think we happen upon the deeperness when we think about how sin comes into play and also how warranted assertion comes into play. You've, I think, indicated this already. Consensus isn't the same thing as truth. And if the consensus that takes the form of a democratic expression is itself damaged, then it's damaged because of something that goes deeper than democracy. And there's a passage in Thomas, the Common Doctor, where, citing Augustine with definite approval, he says, if people become so corrupt that the rule is despotic, then it's incumbent upon good people to challenge that. And I guess you could say that's exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. did. And so what I want to push you on, I guess, is, and I don't think I need to push very hard, democracy isn't the ultimate structure of seeking the common good. It's oftentimes the best structure for seeking the common good, but it isn't the ultimate structure, is it?
Well, that's a complicated issue, Jim, and you've raised a number of very interesting points there about it, because, you started off there with the point that democracy, in a way, is a kind of an overarching platform within which we're looking at some of these questions, and then the question you have there is, how do you justify it? Let's think of it that way. Like, suppose you hold to the democratic system. There's two questions, really. How do you justify it, and what does it mean? But what I would say there is, I think that as part of your worldview, a person has to ask themselves, what political system do they support? And if it's the democratic system, how do they justify it? And they might not necessarily, be wedded to one particular system as the definitive system. But they could take, a Churchillian view, maybe modified a bit, that the democratic system is the best system so far, but not necessarily argue that it's the best system for all time, maybe. But that's one question. Now, the other question is, what does democracy mean? And I think this is where it gets complicated, because we normally say democracy means things like, popular sovereignty. People elect their leaders in some direct way, so everyone has a say. It also involves commitment to certain key values, like justice. Three big ones would be justice, freedom, and equality. Now, the thing about those is they're abstract values, and we need to work out what they mean in practice. And that's where a lot of people disagree. Like, we might accept that, yes, people should be free, but we don't accept we all accept maybe that there has to be a limit to freedom, but we don't accept we don't agree about where to draw the limit. We know that people should be equal, but we don't know specifically what that means in various cases and how to implement it. For example, would it mean that everybody should get a free education? That was something that democracies debated. Or does it mean everybody has a right to health care? By the way, another feature of the democratic system is that we believe everybody has a kind of scheme of rights. But again, we need to know which rights do they have? Where do they come from? How are they to be applied? Now, suppose, Jim, that somebody said, well, now, I don't accept those values you just mentioned there. Then they might be outside the loop today. Normally, the disagreement we have today is where everybody does accept those values in the abstract. We're not really debating about whether the democratic system is the best system or not. The way I like to think of it is we all have our worldview. Within that worldview, we agree, for now at least, that the democratic system is the one we're going to work with. We agree roughly on what it means in the abstract. But it's when we get down to the practicalities of working out these abstract values in the concrete form that we disagree a lot. If somebody rejected the abstract values, which it's a funny thing, you're free to do it in a democracy, but they would be outside the loop then, in the sense that they wouldn't have that platform you were talking about from which to discuss these questions. They would kind of be outside the loop in a certain sense. Now, if I just might mention the political philosopher John Rawls here, some of your listeners will probably know about Rawls' view. He had the position on these set of questions. His position was that maybe we could justify the democratic process in some way independently of our worldviews. And then when we have it all justified and kind of sitting up there as the normative way we proceed, then we bring out our worldviews under that heading. Now, I disagree with that approach. I don't think that approach works. That approach is more risky, I think, for the sort of problem you raised, which is that you could define it in a certain way so that it kind of rigs the democratic debate that then takes place under its umbrella, or it favors some worldviews over others. There's a risk in Rawls' approach, and he's been widely criticized, I think, for that, just for that problem, despite the fact that his theory is intriguing. because it is based on the idea of justifying the political system first. And then given we all accept that, then we bring in our worldviews and we have the debate.
Here are a couple of thoughts. It is the case in what are generally called liberal democracies that there's a certain agreement about rights, equality, rule of law. But we have to consider that, and we do, that we're necessarily today international, and China doesn't accept, its leadership doesn't accept the values of liberal democracy. And when it comes to discussion on an international level, I think there are a number of other countries that, while they're not ordered the way that China is, they're ordered in a way that gives priority to shorthand, the strong man, the rule of the strong, the rule of the efficient, the rule of even still the rule of the tribe. And so we can't accept on a world level, take, for example, the economics of the international scene. We can't really accept what we might accept here. And now we almost never mess up Program Mario, right? That we don't interject the rivulet of the future, the American Solidarity Party. In California, there isn't a two-party system. In New York, there's no longer really a two-party system. In much of the country, there's really no longer a two-party system. And one of the things that the American Solidarity Party wants to do at the level of authentic democratic debate is, as we say, break the duopoly. Right now, it's very interesting. In the state of California, if a person wants to run on a third-party ticket, as opposed to being described as no preference, what a winning phrase, no preference.
Yeah.
If on the ballot you want to be identified as representing such and such a party, your party in the last election, supposing it existed, has to have had 70,000 voters support it, 70,000 or more. That's the cutoff point. When you think of how hard it is to construct a party which has had in its last election cycle 70,000 people support it, if for all practical purposes it didn't exist in the last election cycle, well, you see that there's a lock, a terrific lock.
Yes.
And so when people talk about democracy, there's the philosophical dimension of it, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the first and foremost dimension of it. But in practice, there's only a pathetic attenuation of democracy throughout much of the United States, and even more anemic and pathetic attenuation of democracy in the not-so-great state of California.
Yeah, there's a number of things there, Jim, that are interesting, and it brings us back to Churchill's point about whether these things are abuses of the system or whether they are systemic failures which can't really be corrected. And, we sometimes debate that about whether democracy is really such a flawed system that we need to get rid of it. Sometimes people talk about the money that's in politics, the ridiculous amounts of money that they have when they're running their campaigns, the control that large financial groups have over the democratic process. These are all abuses within the system. And the question is whether they are fatal to it in the long run or whether they can be corrected, while at the same time recognizing that you can't have a perfect system. I think that's what Churchill is saying. But it's a question we have to think about. Are they just abuses of it? Now, even if they're not the same sort of problems that we're talking about. Pluralism is a different problem. That's an issue that you'd have even if you corrected all these other problems.
Yeah.
You'd still have the issue of people disagreeing on fundamental questions and trying to figure out the way forward. But, you just need to think about that sort of question, Jim, from the point of view, I think, of your own party there and its place. Is that cut-off point a reasonable point, given the number of people in California? Or is it a point that was introduced specifically, deliberately, say, to exclude small parties from getting off the ground in order to protect the power of the larger parties?
Yeah, I think that's exactly why it was introduced and why it's sensuously maintained. Let me just add one more point here, and then back to Mario. One more point here. When we talk about money in politics and fundraising in politics, which, of course, right now at this stage of the presidential election cycle, fundraising is the key focus.
Yeah.
There's this hideous irony. What are these funds being raised for? Are they being raised for the widespread dissemination of carefully constructed arguments, or are they being raised for television ads? Well, they're being raised for television ads, and they're being raised in order to actually further entrench a celebrity culture. So-and-so has money, and because so-and-so has money, so-and-so can attract somebody from Hollywood. Because if so-and-so has money, there'll be an audience for the people to be attracted from Hollywood. And it goes around and around.
There's another abuse there, too, I think, guys, that the...
Hey, he switched to guys. He's dropped the gentleman. Did you see that, Mario?
Yeah. I didn't think you'd notice that, guys, but you did.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I'm saying is they often adopt, I think, a utilitarian approach there on that question, Jim, about the money and all that. And what they think is we can kind of do anything to get us elected. Because, even if the means to election, like the money and the fake ads and all that kind of stuff, the avoiding of proper discussion of issues, we're talking about rational argument there, because, we are so much better in a moral sense, better for the country. We're so superior that we can adopt maybe immoral means to get elected. It's an end justifies the means approach. They go straight for politics, at least in the campaign. And then what they sometimes want to argue is, well, when we get elected, then we can govern morally. But because the other guy is so immoral or so evil, we can adopt a few devious tactics to win. Now, again, that's another flaw in a democracy. It shouldn't be like that. But it often is. The elections are really terrible. They're lowest common denominator. And you were talking earlier, Jim, there about sin, which is fascinating because, people do deliberately misrepresent their political opponents' position regularly. And they smear their opponents, and, they do all kinds of things that you'd have to say are just wrong, and they know it, but they're doing it to get elected. And sometimes they'll argue, there's several movies about this, they'll argue that the system forces you into this if you want to win. If you want to win, you do these things. If you want to be pure, you haven't got a hope. Now, again, these are these flaws in the democratic system itself, systemic flaws in it, or are they just abuses of it, which if we rethought it a bit, we could iron out? That's a hard question.
And, even in the Republic, Plato says, what happens here when we have this democracy that's deeply flawed?
Yes, absolutely. He was very suspicious of it for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. That reminds me something very interesting in the history of Latin America. Up to 1945, the term democracy have a very negative connotation across the board because people assume was somehow a view of political reality completely relativistic, completely against religious traditions, and And like liberalism, democracy was seen as a sin, S-I-N. So after Pius XII, radio message in 1944, when he began praising democracy, people start turning the page around and adopting certain type of democracy in all across Latin America, beginning with mainly the Christian Democrats. But in general, the view has been the following. Democracy was called snake skin, which is the shed skin of a snake after molting, because you can fill the skin with whatever content you may want in a particular time and call it democracy. And so that you have a military dictatorship which invokes democracy in order to lead a coup d'etat. You have a populist government which invokes democracy in order to govern based upon the majority in power. And the temptation has been always that, well, then those who are in power are those who have the right solution to society and impose to the rest of the population their solution. And I have a direct experience of that 2 years ago when we visited with a few professors to Cuba, La Habana. And there was a discussion about what democracy really meant there. And, well, the claim made by some Cuban scholar was precisely democracy may have a different meaning to different people. And so, and that kept, particularly in Latin America, this tradition that democracy in itself is just a contest of will and not something that we can reach to a rational agreement. Now, today, things have changed dramatically, particularly in many key countries. And we've come down to this point, I think, that if we want a democratic government or democratic political regime, we need to agree upon something basic, which is based on secular reason. That seems to be the view of many constitutional orders today and political party, secular reason. Now, what happened, I think, according to my observation, is that secular reason implied to many of these scholars secularism.
Yes, exactly.
And that is making the reaction coming from more authoritarian nationalists and even group within the Catholic Church and Protestant groups.
Yes.
What do you think about this making equal or secular reason that seems to imply secularism?
Yeah, I think it's correct, Mario. It's a very good point. I think that in the U.S. in particular, there's a long tradition of, we were talking about the word faith earlier, there's a long tradition, I think, of, at least among scholars and secularists and professors, of thinking or interpreting the word faith to mean without evidence, or you don't care about the evidence, or there's no evidence. And even religious traditions themselves have talked this way a lot, especially evangelical Protestantism, but they're not the only ones. The Catholic Church is infected with this approach too, I think. They talk like their faith is somehow outside of and not therefore subject to reason more than they should. Now, there is a long tradition, though, even in the Protestant tradition of, a rational approach to religion, which we shouldn't overlook. But nevertheless, in general in the U.S., when people look into religions from the outside, they tend to think of faith as where they're just committed to these beliefs, they're not really rational, they couldn't really defend them, therefore, politically, why should everybody else follow them? So what I'm saying is, first of all, we have to have a rational case for our beliefs when we present them publicly. B, religious beliefs can be presented in this way. And C, secularist beliefs themselves are also subject to rational analysis.
Right.
Secular reason is not to be interpreted as the same thing as secularism. That's often the way it's understood. Secular reason just means reason. And if you're saying, well, give me a rational argument, anybody can do that. Now, I do make a distinction in my earlier book about this, that I don't think any religious belief can be brought into politics in that way. I would exclude doctrinal beliefs and certain other beliefs. But I do think a belief, like the example I gave earlier from Martin Luther King, is one where you could, introduce the sort of argument that he presents, for example, in outline form in his letter from the Birmingham jail. That's a very, very clever piece of work, in my view. And in that, he has a religious argument for equality. Now, it's only in outline form, but it's still very, very, very well presented, I think, and very strong. That sort of argument is legitimate in politics. It's religious, and it is also reasonable.
Right. Let me precisely that point. Martin Luther King brought the argument of natural law there into the public square. So do you see any danger of bringing natural law instead of a reasonable religious argument to debate issues in a democracy?
Well, I think the way you might distinguish the two approaches is in the approach I'm arguing for, you can defend religious conclusions by rational argument. And by that I mean, for example, like Martin Luther King's argument for equality is based on one key claim, that there is a God who set up a moral order. So that's a religious view. Now, he could assume, I think, that kind of an argument in politics. He wouldn't necessarily have to make that argument politically. He could just assume it and maybe present it in academia. That's my position on that question. You don't have to actually give the argument publicly, but it just has to be there. Now, natural law generally doesn't approach it that way. Natural law usually leaves religious conclusions like that aside and simply argues based on reason. And it seems to me that that would be a very appropriate approach publicly. Whenever you argue on a moral issue, from certain points of view, you could be said to invoking a type of a natural law approach. You can distinguish between natural law as an approach and historically the content of what the natural law view typically argues, I think.
Right.
That might be a helpful distinction. But yes, I do think that as long as you present it in a rational way, you can present any argument. Because remember what you're doing, Mario. You're saying, like, here's my conclusion. Right. Here's my reasons for it. And if your premises are kind of controversial, putting it in terms of a logical argument, structure, and philosophy, you'd say, now, here's my argument for the premises. And if the premises are complicated, you could say, well, now, I'm not giving you the argument for the premises publicly, but it's available here, in academia or in these thinkers. And now somebody might look at that and say, well, I'm not convinced by those thinkers. But we've already responded to that earlier, that it doesn't really matter whether other people are convinced. It just matters that you're convinced. And it also helps, I think, if a good many people in the society look at your argument and think it's a good argument. Because that kind of validates you, that it's not just you, because you could kind of think an argument is convincing just because you're biased or something. But if a lot of people think it's convincing, that reassures you that you're on the right track. It's not a proof, as we know, because a lot of people can think something is true when it isn't. But at the same time, it helps if a lot of people think the argument is pretty good and not just you.
Yeah. Gentlemen, and I use that word deliberately.
Use it, yes.
We're at the end of our official hour, and in this last series of comments, I couldn't help but think of St. Peter's admonition, have a reason for the faith which is within you. Have a reason for the faith which is within you. I'd like to end with the gospel from today's liturgy. It's from Matthew. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post. He said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. While he was at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. go and learn the meaning of the words, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Thank you very much, Professor Sweetman, for joining us. We'll be in touch because you're clearly somebody that we've got to get back on this program again.
Thank you, gentlemen. I greatly enjoyed it. Very good.
All right. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Mario.
Take care. See you later. Bye-bye. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.